coffin sealed tight, yet someone knocked from within. Welcome to Eco Mysteriosa. I am your host, Ravella. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Your comments make every mystery more alive. Let's begin. It was in the raw, pearl-coloured light of an October morning that a case befell which, even now, sets my blood to a quiet canter when the rain smokes upon the windows and the fire takes its first grip of the coal. London lay under a lid of cloud. Cabs went by with that muffled clop peculiar to wet streets, and the gutters drew silver threads along Baker Street. I had gone early to my old quarters at number 221B, partly out of homesickness for certain tobacco fumes and violin notes that haunt a man more faithfully than many friendships, and partly because the day promised a lull in my practice. Mrs. Hudson had scarcely withdrawn the breakfast tray when footsteps sprang upon the stair, and the door flew wide to admit Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, as bristling as a terrier in a thunderstorm. "Holmes!" cried he, without preface. "I never thought to bring you anything like this. I'll be hanged if I know whether it belongs to the living or the dead." My friend, who had been engaged in that delicate operation of trimming a match stem to an exact inch with the penknife he reserved for such niceties, neither started nor raised an eyebrow. He only inclined his long figure a shade towards the hearth, as a heron may bend above troubled water, and said, "Your statement, though economical, is stimulating. Pray sit, Lestrade. The coffee is tepid, but the society is warm." Lestrade threw himself into the chair I habitually occupied, and I noted with some amusement that he took its arms as a man seizes at moral support. "It's Addington," he began, "Sir Percival Addington, shipping magnate, member for West Barset, and a benefactor to half the hospitals in London. Died day before yesterday of a seizure. His own physician signs to it. Clean as a whistle, says he. This morning was the funeral. Kensal Green, family chapel of rest. Pall-bearers set their shoulders to the box and had it to the catafalque, when—" Lestrade's cheeks, which were weathered to the hue of a winter apple, grew a trifle pale, when there came a knocking, as plain as the beadle's staff on a parish door. "A knocking," I began. "From inside," Lestrade finished. "3 raps, slow and deliberate. You never heard such a scene, Dr. Watson. Ladies fainting, men swearing it was the undertaker's trick. The widow, Lady Addington, to her credit, called out to unscrew the lid. We did it. I swear to you, Holmes." Holmes's hand, which had poised the match stem as though conducting Lestrade's narrative, now came to rest upon his knee. "And what sight rewarded your courage?" he asked in the tone of a physician inviting the first symptom. "The corpse," said Lestrade huskily, "cold as iron and just as dead. Sir Percival, I mean, exactly as laid out, hands folded, chin bound up, the white silk and all. But the lid, on the underside of it, near the level of the face, there were marks, scratches like the run of a fingernail. Fresh, Holmes, fresh, I tell you. And there was a sort of sound when we raised it. Not a breath, don't think that, but how shall I say, a little kiss of the wood letting go, as if someone's mouth had been near it." Holmes leaned back, lids drooping until his eyes shone like 2 cold lamps behind smoked glass, and the coffin preceding the ceremony, was it ever left unattended? Not to my knowledge. The body lay in the chapel from last evening. Family, servants, and the undertaker's men in and out, but not for a minute without one or another present. We'll take statements. The point is, I've got the yard clamouring for imposture, for tricks. The family, mind you, insists on respect. No scandal to their name. But I know what I heard. I know what everyone heard. Those knocks were no carpenter's echo. Holmes made a small tent of his fingers. And the screws of the lid, were they all of one stamp? Lestrade blinked. Of course. Brass screws, 8 to the lid. 8, Holmes murmured. A handsome number for a handsome merchant. Pray continue. There is not much to continue, Lestrade muttered. He looked oddly abashed, as if the very strangeness of his tale put him in an unprofessional light. We replaced the lid. The ceremony went through, barring a few hysterics. I halted the interment on my own authority. Sir Percival's physician swears his patient had been dead past 36 hours. The undertaker swears his work was honest. And the widow, well, she sent me with this. He produced a folded card of heavy cream paper, its corners drowned in black. In a neat, resolute hand was written, Mr. Sherlock Holmes is urgently requested to advise whether a Christian burial may be given to my husband without offence to conscience or to the law. Addington House, Wimpole Street. Lady Addington, said Lestrade, will have us all for murderers if we lay him down while there's a doubt he was living this morning. On the other hand, if it was a trick, if some enemy has played upon her, she wants that enemy's name. She sent the family carriage. It waits below. Holmes rose in that unhurried fashion of his, by which the simple act of gaining his feet became a statement of decision. Watson, said he, your hat. Lestrade, you will accompany us. There is air enough in Kensal Green for courage, but less in a drawing-room. Still, the drawing-room is where we must begin. He took up his old ulster, the collar of which had acquired the very memory of his neck, and we went down together. In the street, the Addington liveries made an island of black among the traffic. A footman stood like a carved ebony figure upon the step. The ride to Wimpole Street was performed in a silence to which each of us contributed his own thoughts. Lestrade's practical mind revolving warrants and examinations, my own reliving the picture of a satin-lined abyss and the dreadful intimacy of those scratches, and Holmes, well, Holmes sat with his chin sunk upon his breast and his eyes half closed, as if nodding assent to some inward argument. Addington House presented that sober magnificence in which wealth disguises itself as duty. We were ushered through a hall hung with the portraits of ships rather than men, sleek clippers with bellies like greyhounds and steamers that smoked against sunsets, and into a small morning-room where the widow awaited us. She was not what I had expected. Grief sits in 100 attitudes, but in her it had a straight spine and clear eyes. Hers was a pale, intelligent face, framed in widow's weeds of an admirable simplicity. By her stood a younger lady with auburn hair, and that prettiness which derives more from sincerity than feature, and a gentleman of our own age, square-shouldered, whose complexion had the brown of recent foreign climates. Mr. Holmes, said Lady Addington, with a slight movement that was neither curtsy nor bow, so much as acknowledgment that necessity had outstripped ceremony. I am obliged to you. Inspector Lestrade has told you what occurred. The essential points, Holmes returned, with that deferential dryness which women of character have always drawn out of him. Will you desire my opinion as to the moral and legal propriety of your husband's burial? And beyond that, the nature of a phenomenon which has wounded your confidence and your peace. This is my niece, Miss Clara Willoughby, said her ladyship, and my brother, Captain Basil Darnell, lately returned from Bombay. Captain Darnell made us a stiff, sailorly bow. Damn if I understand it, Mr. Holmes. He broke in. Percy was a strong man, overstrong, took to driving his body like a dray-horse. But dead is dead, sir. And yet, well, I heard it myself. If there is villainy, Holmes repeated, it shall find a name. He moved a pace nearer to the widow. First, may I ask, between your husband's death and this morning's ceremony, was he at any time removed from the house? No, said Lady Addington. He died here in his dressing-room. The physician, Dr. Malmesbury, attended within half an hour. The undertaker came in the evening. Percy lay in the chapel overnight, as is customary with us. Who sat with him during the night? A quick colour touched the younger lady's cheek. I did, Miss Willoughby said. A footman Green relieved me for an hour past 3. Holmes's eyes brightened a fraction. You heard nothing? Nothing, sir, beyond the creak of the wainscot and the rain at the windows. Rain at the windows. Rain. Captain Darnell broke in again. Look here, Holmes, permission to speak plainly? There's money in this, you'll be thinking. Percy handled more gold than a Rajah, and had the enemies to match. A week ago, a certain Italian, calling himself Signor Farini, came twice to the house, pressing some South American venture. I told Percy to kick him downstairs. He went out by the door, but not willingly. Lady Addington's hand closed and opened upon her handkerchief. Battle, we agreed to tell the truth, said the sailor grimly. If there's a foreign hand in this, better to own it. Holmes had turned to the mantel, upon which stood a small ebony clock, flanked by 2 miniature ships under glass. He examined without touching a faint smear upon the white marble, a crescent where a glass might lately have been set down. His gaze travelled on, as if idly, to a pair of delicate gloves laid upon a chair-back. Morning gloves, neatly folded but showing a thread loosened at the wrist. His nostrils dilated as if upon some temperate perfume. Inspector, said he at last, you have postponed the interment? I have, pending instructions. Good. Then I must ask to see the chapel and the coffin as soon as we leave here. Lady Addington, a last question. Was your husband a man of method by all accounts, accustomed to carry upon his person any token that would be instantly missed? She looked surprised. His signet ring, she said. A green stone, peridot, engraved with a stag currant. He called it his luck. It is on his finger now. Holmes's eyes, which had been half veiled, opened with that sudden surgical clearness I have seen discomfit more hardened men than Lestrade. You are certain? I believe so, said she, with the smallest hesitation. It was placed there after he was laid out. The undertaker's man, Mr. Cribb, told me it would soothe appearances. Holmes bowed. Appearances are often soothed by exactly the things that trouble realities. Come, Watson. Come, Lestrade. Captain, Miss Willoughby, Lady Addington, you shall have news of us before the noon is old. In the corridor he quickened his pace until the footman trotted to keep beside him. The chapel, if you please, said he, as we followed. I murmured something of the Italian adventurer, of the ring, of the indecency of any person who would exploit the sanctity of death itself. Indecency, Holmes returned, with the air of one filing away a specimen rather than engaging in moral debate, is a word created by the living to taunt the dead with their lack of resources. Hush, Watson. We are about to see whether the dead on this occasion knocked back. The Addington chapel was small and dim, panelled in dark wood that drank the light, and smelling faintly of lilies and damp stone. Upon trestles, under a black pall stitched with a silver cross, lay the coffin. The undertaker, a tall, spare man with lips like a sealed envelope, stood waiting with his assistant. His expression was professionally bereaved. Mr. Cribb, said Holmes with that politeness which he uses as a pelican uses its beak. We will view the screws. At a nod, the assistant went round with a turnscrew, pausing over each shining boss in turn. I am no carpenter, and should have sworn they were all of a piece. Holmes, however, held up a hand. Spare me the performance, my good fellow, he murmured. I desire only the heads. Ah, yes, Watson, observe. 7 heads of standard stamp, but the third from the left on the near side bears a hairline scratch transverse to the slot. A man's turn-screw makes that. A factory does not. Lestrade, pray mark it." "It may have been done this morning," the inspector objected. "It may," said Holmes softly. "And yet, Mr. Cribb, the ring. Is the gentleman's signet upon his finger?" The undertaker's sealed lips parted by the breadth of a shilling. "It was, sir," he said stiffly. "We do not molest jewels upon a Christian corpse." "And yet," Holmes returned, "you molested truth upon a Christian lid." His eyes had gone to the inner edge of the pall, where a faint dust lay upon the black, a pale sprinkle like flour upon a baker's sleeve. He pinched a trace between finger and thumb and lifted it to his nose. "Cedar," he murmured. "Fresh and cut recently. Lestrade, the lid again, if you please. No, do not remove it. Lay your ear upon the wood." Lestrade did so, with a stubborn courage worthy of the yard. We all held our breath. There came no sound but the throb of London beyond the stone, and the far tick of the little ebony clock in the widow's morning-room, which my fancy insisted upon hearing. Lestrade straightened, a trifle red in the face. "Well?" he demanded. Holmes's gaze was on the pall, upon a crease where the cloth broke and made a small shadow, like a bird's wing. "Well?" he said, and for the first time there was in his voice that suppressed excitement which I knew heralded action. "The dead are admirably quiet when they are permitted to lie. It is the living who tap. The living," I echoed. "Precisely." Holmes stepped back, and his eyes flicked from the scratched screw to the pale dust upon the pall, and thence to the dark panelling glimmering with old polish. "Inspector, retain the chapel and its contents under guard. Mr. Cribb, you will not approach this coffin without my leave. Watson, we return to the house for 2 small trifles, and then to Kensal Green again." "For what purpose?" Lestrade demanded. "To discover," said Sherlock Holmes, as we passed once more under the portraits of eager ships, "why a man who was stone dead thought it worth the trouble to knock." We returned to the morning-room by the same route, and I observed that Holmes, who had seemed languid as a cat a moment before, now moved with that peculiar lightness which always betokened a plan forming under his skull. Lady Addington had not stirred from her chair, yet the younger lady stood at the window with her fingers upon the sash as if to test the rain's persistence. The sailor paced and turned, his boot soles crisp upon the Turkey carpet. "Forgive me," said Holmes at once, "if I require a few particulars from each of you. I shall be as brief as conscience allows. First, Lady Addington, your husband's last hours. Were they passed alone?" "In part," she replied. "He supped lightly and spoke of a memorandum to be sent to his clerk. He suffered a seizure upon rising from his chair. I rang. Dr. Malmesbury is but 3 doors off." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, and his eyes rested again upon the faint crescent upon the marble. "He came quickly then, within 20 minutes. He pronounced that nothing could be done." "And the body remained in the dressing-room until evening?" "Yes, you noticed nothing disarranged. Only the waistcoat upon the floor," she said after a pause, too true for invention. "Percy was not careless of his garments." Holmes nodded. "Miss Willoughby, you have courage, and good eyes, I think. When you sat your vigil, did you observe the ring upon Sir Percival's finger?" She coloured again, but looked him straightly in the face. "I thought of it because the stone seemed out of place amongst the white wrappings. Yes, Mr. Holmes, the ring was there." Holmes turned to the captain. "You spoke of a foreign gentleman, Signor Farini. Do you recall his card? The street of his lodgings?" "A tawdry fellow," Captain Darnell growled, "but sharp as a sail-needle. He left a card from the Hotel Palermo in Jermyn Street. Claimed knowledge of nitrate cargoes upon the Plata." "Thank you. And now, Inspector, we must borrow the doctor for 5 minutes, Dr. Malmesbury. a neat person of 50 with the expression of a clerk and the hands of a violinist, arrived with a professional bow and the accustomed phrases on his lips. Holmes cut them gently away. "Spare me technicalities, Doctor. You found Sir Percival dead of apoplexy." "So I judged," said he, blinking. There was congestion of the face and a slight frothing, no sign of struggle. He had complained of heaviness in the chest these past months, but refused regimen. "You examined the pupils?" "As a matter of routine. Dilated, but not unequally." "And you would swear to 36 hours' death at the time of this morning's ceremony?" "I would and do." Holmes tapped the blotter upon the escritoire. "Your caution becomes you, and the widow owes you gratitude. Did you observe any puncture upon the arm? A scratch, a bruise?" The doctor hesitated. "There was a mark upon the left forearm, no larger than the nib of a pen. Old, I thought. The late gentleman hunted, and he fenced a little." "Quite." Holmes's nostrils thinned again. He lifted the gloves from the chair back and offered them, not to the widow, but to Miss Willoughby. "You wore these to the chapel?" She shook her head. "They are Eliza's, my aunt's maid. She laid them there when she brought tea. I could not drink." "The maid is in the house?" "She is," said Lady Addington, displeasure stirring at last beneath the smooth surface of her composure. "But surely we shall not accuse her of aught but honesty," Holmes returned, with that sudden warmth which always reassured the innocent. "Inspector, oblige me by asking the footman Green to come up." Green proved a tall, freckled young man with honest eyes, afflicted, like many honest men, with a terror of authority which makes them appear guilty when they are not. His hands betrayed him as those of a stable lad promoted too quickly. Strong, ingrained with the ghost of harness oil. "You relieved Miss Willoughby at 3?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir. Did you sleep?" He swallowed. "Once, sir, for a few minutes. I beg pardon to her ladyship I sat, and the warmth and the smell of the lilies." His shame was so heartfelt that it silenced rebuke at its birth. "And when you woke?" Mr. Cribb came with his man to measure. "He told me to keep the candles fresh." Holmes's eyes were upon the young man's boots. "You have been upon the chapel floor this morning?" "Yes, sir. The inspector sent me to fetch a scarf the lady dropped." "Very good." Holmes's gaze darted once to the maid's gloves, once to the crescent on the marble, and came to rest upon the clock. "We go to the dressing-room, Watson." The chamber where Sir Percival had died was orderly, but it had the sad order which men impose after the event, and which contains its own confession of change. The clothes-brush lay awry upon the table, a waistcoat hung from a chair-back, and upon a small stand I saw a curious contrivance like a travelling inkwell with a spring cap. Holmes took it up, sniffed it, and set it down again. "Ether," he said. "Not used, but old. Observe the waistcoat." He shook it out, and 2 objects fell from the pocket. A ticket stub from St. James's Hall, and a small brass screw of no domestic sort. He did not touch them until he had drawn his lens. Then, with his long forefinger, he indicated a smear upon the waistcoat's lining. "Camphorated oil, see the bloom? And a darker trace here, which our good doctor did not remark. Watson?" I bent and smelled. "Bitter almond, precisely," said Holmes. "A ghost of prussic acid. Hardly enough to frighten a rabbit, but quite enough to tickle a coroner if he had the leisure. Put them up, if you please." He wrapped the screw and the stub in paper and consigned them to his pocket-book. His eyes, meanwhile, travelled across the room with a methodical patience, which I have compared elsewhere to a farmer's inspection of a strange field, testing the gates, feeling the soil, noting the lie of the hedge. "The fireplace is swept," he murmured, "yet here is an unburnt cinder of cedar. We meet the same wood again. The window sash, dust undisturbed, and the dressing table, He pointed to a narrow groove upon the oak, at the height of a man's chest. It was minute but fresh. "A wire passed here within the week," he said. "To what end? And why cedar in a house that smells of English oak?" Before I could answer, the captain's voice sounded at the door. "Holmes, are you done with your catechism? The carriage is ready if you must go to that melancholy field." "In a moment," said Holmes. "Watson, fetch me 2 trifles from the hall umbrella stand, the stout walking stick with the malacca head, and the coil of cord behind it." I saw both upon our entering. I obeyed. When I returned, he was at the window again, drawing a breath as men draw it before diving. He took the stick and cord without comment. "Now, Inspector, the chapel once more, and speedily." We descended together. The undertaker looked ill-pleased at our reappearance, but he stood aside under Lestrade's eye. Holmes laid the stick upon the pole, so that it made a ridge along the length of the coffin. Then, with the cord, he contrived a loop and slipped it beneath the edge of the lid near the scratched screw. "Kindly place your hands thus, Watson," he said. "We do not raise the lid, we only threaten to." He tightened the cord by a hair's breadth. We all listened. At first there was nothing but the soft complaint of the cloth. Then, so slight that I half believed it fancy, there came a whisper of movement within the panelled wall behind the trestles, as if a mouse had ventured and reconsidered. Holmes's eyes glinted. "Not the dead, Inspector," he murmured. "Courage takes many forms. We shall choose the one that produces the fewest screams. Close that door quietly. Bar it. Mr. Cribb, do not stir." He slipped the cord free and laid it down. "The interment is postponed," he said formally, "by the authority of the law and the common sense of England. Now, Lestrade, your best man at the side passage, another at the mews door, and silence for 10 minutes. After that we shall require a screwdriver and a lantern. There is a person who has been very patient. It is time we rewarded him with air." Lestrade obeyed with the alacrity of a man who feels his ground shifting beneath him. 2 constables were summoned from the gate, their boots muffled upon the flagstones as they took station. Holmes, meanwhile, stooped to the base of the panelling behind the coffin, where his fingers lingered upon a line almost invisible to my untrained eye. He drew from his pocket a thin blade, slipped it into the seam, and gave the gentlest pressure. A panel swung back upon a concealed hinge with no more sound than a sigh. A breath of air issued forth, stale, but not of the grave. "Watson, the lantern," said he. The undertaker's man, pale as parchment, produced it with shaking hands. Its beam revealed a narrow recess scarcely deeper than the length of a man's shoulders. Within it crouched a figure, pressed close as if moulded to the wood. The eyes, wild and ringed with hollows, blinked at the light. The lips moved, but no sound came. He was a man of middling height, foreign of feature, with a close-cropped beard and garments travel-stained. His hands bore the red crescents of nails driven into flesh by desperate restraint. The cry that burst from Miss Willoughby, who had followed despite her aunt's remonstrance, was quickly smothered by the captain's grasp. Lestrade thrust forward, but Holmes checked him with a hand upon the sleeve. "Not roughly, Inspector. He has suffered the coffin's company, and that is punishment enough." The stranger staggered forth, his limbs trembling. Holmes caught him beneath the elbow and guided him to a chair, where he sat gasping, the lantern's glow upon his haggard face. For some moments none spoke, and we could hear only the dull tolling of a church bell somewhere beyond the fog. "Signor Farini, I presume," Holmes said at last, with that quiet certainty which left no room for denial. "Room for denial." The man's head jerked up, and his lips formed words in a thick accent. "Ah, yes, but not murderer. Never that." He pressed his palms together in a gesture half supplication, half oath. Lady Addington had entered unbidden, her veil thrown back, her face set in marble lines. "This man," she said in a low voice, "came here to hound my husband with his schemes. Why is he in my chapel?" "That," Holmes replied, "is the matter to be established. He has chosen an extraordinary lodging which suggests compulsion more than convenience." He turned upon the man with the sudden steely directness which could strip pretense like bark from a tree. "Speak quickly, Farini. How came you to this place? Who placed you there, and for what end?" The Italian wrung his hands. "I sought only to persuade Sir Percival to invest, to join with me. I came the night he died. Late, too late. A man met me at the door, saying the master yet breathed and would grant me word. Fool, I followed. They led me to the chamber, then seized me. Chloroform, I knew no more. When I woke, I was here in the dark, shut like cargo in a hold. I pounded, I scratched, but no one came until the coffin moved, and I thought, God forgive me, I thought they buried me alive. The tale poured forth in broken English, yet with a ring of truth that could not easily be feigned." Holmes regarded him as one might study an insect pinned to the board, cold, detached, yet with infinite attention. "Describe this man who met you." "A servant, tall, thin, with hair dark as night. He wore a coat of livery, green," Lestrade demanded. Farini shook his head violently. "No, older, sharper. His voice was smooth, but his hands iron." Holmes's gaze flicked once to Lady Addington, who stood rigid as carved ivory. "Your household numbers how many men-servants, madam?" "3, she answered stiffly. "Green, the butler, and old James, who is half crippled and could never—" "Then we must seek a 4th, Holmes murmured. "One not on the household rolls, but introduced for a purpose. Inspector, have your men close every exit. If this intruder is still in the house, he must not slip away." Lestrade hurried out, his voice echoing down the passage. Holmes, meanwhile, examined Farini's wrists, upon which there lingered faint traces of oil, as though ropes had been greased before binding him. He sniffed the cuffs of the man's coat, then bent and retrieved from the recess a scrap of cloth, torn and smelling strongly of camphor. He tucked it into his pocket without comment. The silence grew heavy, broken only when Captain Darnell burst out, "By heaven, Holmes, this is devil's work! My brother dead, a foreign rogue in the walls, and now some phantom servant who comes and goes unseen. If you know aught, speak it plain." Holmes straightened. His eyes gleamed with that peculiar light which meant that, though he did not yet hold the whole thread, he grasped its end. "Plain speaking is rarely welcome before its hour, Captain. Yet I may say this much. Sir Percival did not knock from within his coffin. The hand that sought attention was another's, and the scratches bear witness. But whether the man we see is victim or accomplice, that remains to be determined." At this, Lady Addington gave a sudden cry and sank into her chair, her self-command at last shaken. Miss Willoughby hastened to her side while Holmes stood motionless, his gaze travelling from the widow's bowed head to the undertaker's sealed lips, and thence to the half-open panel still breathing out its stale odour of cedar. "Watson," said he quietly, "remain with our guest. He may have more to confess. I must speak a word with Lady Addington alone." He crossed to her with a courtesy that seemed almost old-fashioned in its gentleness, bent, and whispered something I could not catch. She started, her eyes widening with mingled fear and astonishment. Then, regaining her composure, she inclined her head. Holmes straightened once more, and for the first time since the affair began, I saw his lips curve in the faintest shadow of a smile. The game "My dear Watson," he murmured as he turned back, "is afoot indeed." Farini, left to my care, clutched at the arms of his chair, with the air of a man who still half expected the lid of a coffin to shut above him. His breathing steadied by degrees, and presently he turned imploring eyes upon me. "Doctor, you believe me? I am no devil. They made me prisoner. Why, I do not know." I could only answer that truth and guilt alike must stand the same scrutiny in Holmes's presence. The Italian shivered and drew the lamp nearer, as though the light alone assured his existence. Meanwhile, Holmes had withdrawn with Lady Addington into the embrasure of the window. Their voices were too low for me to distinguish words, but I noted the inflexible poise of her head and the quick, incisive gestures of Holmes's long fingers. Presently she uttered a sound between protest and assent. Holmes bowed slightly and returned, while she, pale but composed once more, remained seated with her niece beside her. "Inspector," Holmes said, as Lestrade re-entered with news that no unknown servant could be found, "you will cause the household books to be inspected, and each servant examined under oath. Yet I venture we seek one who does not belong within these walls at all. He came with purpose and left with it unfinished. The panel tells its tale. Concealment prepared beforehand, cedar freshly cut to disguise some odour, and oil upon the ropes to keep the captive quiet. There is art here, but not the art of Farini." Lestrade glanced at the Italian with open suspicion. "He may have accomplices, Holmes. These foreigners breed like rabbits." Holmes waved the remark aside. "Accomplices, yes, but of what breed we shall learn. I prefer facts, and here is one, Sir Percival's ring. It was said to rest upon his finger this morning. I desire to see it with my own eyes." The undertaker, pale as candle wax, stepped forward with visible reluctance. At Holmes's nod, the lid was again unscrewed, but only so far as to permit the gentleman's hand to be drawn forth. The sight of that waxen limb in its white wrappings sent a chill through the room. Yet what fixed my gaze, and Lestrade's as well, was the naked finger where the ring should have been. It was bare, the skin slightly indented, as though the jewel had been worn long and only lately removed. A murmur of astonishment broke from those present. Holmes bent low, examining with lens and lamp. "Observe," he said softly, "the edges are faintly reddened. The ring was twisted away after death, not before. Whoever stole it did so when Sir Percival lay prepared in his coffin. A curious theft, Lestrade, curious and bold. By the Lord!" the captain exclaimed. "Are we then to suppose this fellow—" Holmes silenced him with a lifted hand. "No, Captain. The prisoner of the coffin had no need of the ring, but another had, and it is that other whom we must bring to light. For a ring may open doors where gold itself falters." Farini, in his agitation, broke in with a cry. "Yes, yes, I told him of it. I told Sir Percival his signet could command the warehouses at Callao, that with it and his name I could draw credit. That is why they sought me, why they sought him." His voice rose in panic until Holmes quelled him with a sharp glance. "Enough. You have furnished more than you know. Watson, replace the hand. Inspector, let the lid rest again. We shall not disturb the dead further until the living have been more closely examined." The screws were fastened once more, the pole drawn smooth, and silence fell in the chapel, save for the faint stir of the fog beyond its windows. Holmes turned briskly, his energy like a spark in the gloom. "Now, gentlemen, the path lies clear before us. The theft of the ring is the key, not the apparition of Knox. Farini was hidden to distract, not to act. While all eyes were fixed upon his confinement, another hand rifled the coffin. The question is, whose hand? Lestrade muttered that every servant must be stripped to the bone if need be. Holmes inclined his head. "You may examine them, but mark me, cunning of this sort seldom resides below stairs. It sits in chambers with curtains drawn, where grief is most loudly professed. Captain, you will forgive me if I urge that none of the household leave this roof until the truth is bare. We return now to the morning room, now back among the sombre portraits of ships. Holmes stood with his back to the fire, his figure a black spear against the glow. Lady Addington had recovered her composure, though her lips trembled faintly when she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, you said a word to me, something which has filled me with dread. Do you mean that my husband's death was not natural?" Holmes's eyes softened, though his voice was grave. "I mean only that certain appearances warrant a more rigorous inquiry than has yet been given. Poison, though subtle, leaves traces that cannot hide forever. Your physician's word I do not dispute, but a fuller examination must be made before we can lay Sir Percival in the earth with confidence." Her hands tightened upon the chair-arms, yet she met his gaze steadily. "Do what you must. I ask only that the scandal be spared if possible." Holmes bowed slightly, then turned to Lestrade. "Guard the house. Postmen at each entrance. I shall require a word with Dr. Malmesbury once more, and after that, a visit to Jermyn Street. For the next act of this drama lies not with the dead, but with the living who profit by his death." And with that he took up his hat and coat, his manner as cool as if he set forth for an evening's concert, rather than the pursuit of a murderer. I followed, though with a heaviness at heart, for the shadows in Addington House seemed to lengthen rather than retreat. The fog clung thick upon Wimpole Street as we emerged, curling against the lamps like smoke from an unseen fire. Holmes strode quickly, his head bowed, his stick tapping the pavement in measured strokes that betrayed thought rather than haste. I kept close, unwilling to disturb his silence, until at last he spoke, half to himself, half to me. "A theft of a ring, Watson, but not for ornament. A ring that serves as signature, as seal, as open sesame to vaults and warehouses. What then does that theft proclaim? Not sentiment, not greed, but commerce, and commerce upon a scale fit to shake empires." We hailed a cab and were borne toward Jermyn Street, where the Hotel Palermo presented itself as a modest establishment with a foreign air. Lace curtains yellowed by smoke, balconies with chipped ironwork, and the faint odour of garlic from its kitchen. Holmes dismissed the cab and entered at once, asking for Signor Farini's chambers with such authority that the clerk, though wary, offered no resistance. We were led to a narrow stair, and thence to a room upon the second floor, which the proprietor unlocked for us with evident reluctance. The chamber bore the unmistakable marks of a hasty search. Drawers stood open, clothes flung carelessly, papers scattered. Holmes moved lightly among them, his eyes darting here and there, while I stooped to collect what seemed to be fragments of correspondence. The script was foreign, a mixture of Italian and Spanish, filled with references to cargoes, nitrate, and credit notes. Holmes's gaze, however, settled not on the papers, but upon a small travelling trunk beside the bed. He knelt, examined the lock, and with a delicate turn of his penknife sprang it open. Within lay little of value save for a folded map, heavily creased, showing the harbours of Callao and Valparaiso. Upon its margin, drawn in pencil, was a sketch of a stag current, the same device I knew that graced Sir Percival's signet. Holmes studied it for a long moment, then replaced it with a curious smile. "You see, Watson, the ring is the key that fits this sketch. With it, one might pass as Addington himself in the Americas, and unlock credits his name alone could command. A bold plan, and one demanding bold theft. But who here in London had both knowledge of its value and opportunity to snatch it from the coffin? Before I could hazard a reply, a sound from the passage reached us. The shuffle of a foot. Too cautious for a guest, too clumsy for a thief. Holmes was at the door in an instant, flinging it wide. A man lurched back, thin and cadaverous, with eyes as sharp as awls beneath a shock of dark hair. He wore no livery now, but his bearing was that of a servant accustomed to slipping where he ought not to be. "Your fourth man, Watson," Holmes said quietly. He seized the fellow's wrist with a grip that brooked no resistance. "And what do you hear, my friend, sniffing about another's chamber?" The man snarled and made as if to break free. But Holmes's long fingers tightened, and the struggle ended before it began. "Sname," Holmes commanded. The fellow spat. "Marek!" Holmes's eyes glittered. "A name fit for the dock. You served in Addington House." Marek gave no answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Holmes searched him swiftly and drew forth from an inner pocket a crumpled handkerchief. Unfolded, it revealed a gleam. The peridot ring itself, its green stone winking even in the dim light. I confess I gave an involuntary exclamation, for here was the object upon which so much had turned. "Caught with the goods," Holmes murmured. "And yet do not be too hasty, Watson. Marek is not the hand that conceived this plan. He is but a tool, clumsy enough to betray himself. The brain lies elsewhere." Marek's eyes blazed with a hatred that seemed too large for his narrow frame. "You know nothing," he hissed in a thick accent. "The English think they own the world. But others can claim too." Holmes's voice cut like a scalpel. "And others pay you, Marek, to crawl into coffins and filch rings from dead men's fingers. Who is it? Speak, or you will find Newgate less forgiving than I." But the man only pressed his lips together, his jaw rigid with the stubbornness of one who fears his master more than the law. Holmes regarded him a moment, then released his wrist with a gesture of contempt. "Very well. Lestrade will prize it out of you with warrants and cells. But I have what I require, the proof that the theft was deliberate and the signet recovered." We returned him under escort to the yard, where Lestrade received us with eyes wide at the sight of the ring. "Holmes, this is a clean case now. The fellow is guilty as Judas. I'll clap him up tonight." Holmes shook his head. "Do so by all means, but beware of simple answers to complex puzzles. Marek is the hand, not the head. Until we catch the head, the game remains unfinished." As we left the yard and walked once more into the thick night, I turned to Holmes, bewildered. "Surely, my dear fellow, the matter is resolved. We have the culprit, the ring, the means." Holmes's lips curved in that thin smile, which was half triumph, half irony. "Resolved, Watson. No. We have but peeled the first skin of the onion. Ask yourself, who admitted Marek to Addington House, and why? Who knew the value of that ring, and how it might open vaults across the sea? Marek cannot read shipping ledgers or draft maps of harbours. No, the true culprit moves still in freedom, and with a purpose that grows more dangerous the longer he remains at large." He hailed another cab, his eyes alight. "Back to Wimpole Street, Watson, for I suspect the answer waits not in distant Jermyn Street, but beneath the very roof where Sir Percival drew his last breath." The cab bore us swiftly back through the fog-veiled streets, the clip of the horse's hooves striking a rhythm to Holmes's silence. I knew that silence too well to disturb it. His eyes were half closed, but his fingers beat lightly upon the sill, as though keeping time with some inward reasoning. At length, as the lamps of Wimpole Street swam once more into view, he roused himself with a short breath. "Watson, we tread dangerous boards. The curtain has not yet risen upon the final act, but the players are already in position. It is not the thief we must fear, but the director of the play. Addington House lay hushed, as though grief had settled like dust in every corner. Lestrade's men stood watch at the doors, their forms looming in the mist. Within, the household was gathered once more in the morning-room, summoned by Holmes's request. Lady Addington, proud even in weariness, sat by the fire with her niece close at hand. Captain Darnell paced as before, his arms folded, the strain of impatience etched in every movement. Dr. Malmesbury hovered discreetly near the window, his hands clasped behind his back with the air of one anxious to remain useful. Holmes advanced to the hearth, the recovered ring glinting between his fingers. A murmur ran through the group at the sight of it. Lady Addington pressed her hand to her lips, Miss Willoughby uttered a faint cry, and the captain strode forward. "Ah, by heaven! You have it then," Marek confessed. Holmes's voice was cool and even. "On the contrary, Captain, Marek confessed nothing. He was discovered with the ring in his possession, but his silence is more instructive than any speech. It tells us that he serves another, and that he fears betrayal more than he fears the yard." Lestrade, who had followed us in, grunted. "That's a lawyer's quibble." The man was caught with the goods. "What more do you want?" "I want," Holmes said, "to know who among you profited by the theft. For Marek, a poor rogue, could neither employ this ring in South American ports, nor understand the intricacies of credit and seal. Yet someone here, someone who knew of the ring's power, guided his hand. A silence fell. The crackle of the fire was loud in the hush. Then Lady Addington spoke, her voice low but steady. "Mr. Holmes, are you accusing my household? My family?" Holmes inclined his head with courtesy, though his eyes were unflinching. "I accuse no one until the evidence compels me. But consider, Sir Percival dead, his ring removed, a foreign adventurer imprisoned in his own chapel as a spectacle to distract from the theft. These are no random acts. They form a pattern, one that could only be drawn by a mind both audacious and intimately acquainted with Sir Percival's affairs." Captain Darnell struck the mantel with his fist. "You mean Farini? The fellow's schemes, his damned nitrate dreams." "Who else?" Holmes shook his head. "Farini was a pawn, useful as a distraction, yet himself deceived and confined. No, Captain, the hand lies closer." His gaze swept the room, pausing at each face. "Lady Addington, you told me this morning that it was the undertaker's man who assured you the ring had been placed upon your husband's finger, yet it was not there when I examined it. Either Mr. Cribb lied, which I doubt, or another hand removed it after his laying out. A hand trusted, perhaps, to make such small adjustments unremarked." Dr. Malmesbury stirred uneasily, his narrow shoulders twitching. "Surely you do not imply—" "On the contrary," Holmes said quickly, "I exonerate you, Doctor. You had no more thought for a ring than for a button. But you, Captain Darnell, what of you? You spoke freely of the Italian, of his scheme, of the value of the ring abroad. How came you by such precise knowledge?" The captain wheeled upon him, his weathered face darkening. "Because I was present, man. I heard Farini press his case. I warned my brother against him. And now you dare—" "Peace, Basil," Lady Addington said sharply, laying a hand upon her brother's arm. But her eyes did not leave Holmes's face, and I saw in them both fear and a strange resignation. Holmes continued, relentless. "You are a sailor, Captain, familiar with harbours and credit notes. You knew what that map in Farini's trunk implied, even before I did. Marek served you, did he not? A foreign tool, useful in darker errands. You brought him into the house under some pretext, set him to steal the ring, and contrived the Italian's imprisonment to mask the theft. Bold, ingenious, but incomplete, for you forgot that scratches upon a coffin lid speak more eloquently than silence, and that cedar dust tells tales to the trained nose. For an instant I thought Darnell would strike him. His fists clenched, his frame taut as a drawn bow, but Holmes's piercing gaze held him as surely as iron fetters. Then, with a harsh laugh, the captain flung himself into a chair. "You devil," he muttered. "You see everything." Lady Addington rose suddenly, her composure cracking. "Basil, no! For God's sake!" Holmes raised a hand. "Not here, madam. Let us not rend family ties before strangers. But the truth must out, and quickly. Inspector, you have heard enough to warrant closer inquiry. Place Captain Darnell under guard. He will have opportunity to explain himself fully before the law." Lestrade stepped forward, his face a mixture of triumph and unease, for he was never happiest when Holmes outpaced him. Yet before he could lay a hand upon the captain's arm, the man leapt to his feet once more, eyes blazing. "You'll not cage me like a rat!" he shouted. With sudden violence, he thrust Lady Addington aside and sprang for the door. The room erupted, Miss Willoughby's cry, Lestrade's curse, Holmes in pursuit with the speed of a greyhound. I followed, heart pounding, as the captain's boots thundered down the corridor and out into the misty night. Holmes was close upon him, his long strides devouring the distance, but Darnell knew the ground, and with a sudden turn he vanished into the fog-bound garden, leaving only the crash of a gate and the echo of his defiance. Holmes halted, breathing hard but composed, his keen eyes scanning the darkness. "So," he said at last, "the play moves into its final act. The ring recovered, the pawn revealed, and the true culprit fled. Come, Watson, our night's work is not done." We plunged into the fog after him, our footsteps muffled on the damp gravel. The garden was a maze of clipped hedges and bare-limbed trees whose shadows loomed and vanished in the lantern light of Lestrade's men. Somewhere ahead came the crack of a branch, the rasp of breath, and then silence. Holmes raised a hand, halting us. "He doubles back," he whispered. "Mark the earth, Watson. See the heel turned inward? He runs not to flee, but to conceal." We followed the faint spoor across the lawn to a tool shed by the wall. Its door stood ajar, and within the dim gleam of metal caught our eyes. We rushed in, expecting to find the captain crouched among spades and rakes. Instead, the place was empty, save for a ladder thrust against the far wall, its top vanishing through a trap in the ceiling. Holmes mounted at once, light as a cat, and I close behind. The loft was low and dusty, filled with tarpaulins, broken crates, and the pungent odour of cedar shavings. In the corner crouched Basil Darnell, a pistol in his hand. At our sudden appearance he raised it, but Holmes, with a swift lunge, struck it aside. The shot went wide, burying itself in the timber. Lestrade scrambled up in time to seize the weapon, while Holmes pressed the captain back against the wall with the Malacca stick. "Enough theatrics, Darnell," Holmes said, his voice cold. "You have shown your hand and fired your shot. The yard will not be so forgiving." Darnell's face was a mask of rage and despair. "You think you've won, Holmes? You know nothing of what drove me." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I know enough. Your brother's wealth, tied up in ventures you could not touch. The South American scheme dangled before you, promising fortune if only you could command his seal. You saw in Farini a means, in Marek a tool, and in your sister's trust a shield. But you miscalculated. You thought the Coffin a perfect stage, the Knox a diversion no one would unravel. You forgot that the smallest trace betrays the largest crime." The captain's shoulders sagged, yet he forced a bitter laugh. And what of it? You'll hand me over, and the family name will drown in scandal. Is that what you want, Holmes? Holmes's eyes softened, though his grip did not falter. I want only the truth, Captain. How justice deals with it is not mine to command. But the truth will out, whether whispered in courts or written on tombstones. Lestrade, puffing from the climb, clapped irons upon the man with evident relief. That will do, sir. You'll have your say before the magistrate. We descended, our prisoner between us, and re-entered the house where Lady Addington awaited, pale as the veil she wore. At sight of her brother in chains, she swayed, and Miss Willoughby sprang to her side. "No more," Lady Addington whispered. "Spare us no more." Holmes, ever merciful where women were concerned, inclined his head gravely. "Madam, the worst is past. The ring is recovered, the plot unmasked. Your husband shall have his Christian burial unsullied by doubt. The rest lies with the law. Darnell was led away under guard, his defiance silenced by the weight of certainty. Yet as the door closed upon him, Holmes remained by the fire, his gaze fixed upon the embers, as though seeing beyond them. I ventured, "Is it indeed finished, Holmes?" "Not quite, Watson," he murmured. "The theft is explained, the culprit secured, but the manner of Sir Percival's death remains clouded. Poison lingers in the air of that dressing-room. A seizure, the doctor called it. Yet the faint trace of prussic acid upon the waistcoat, the ether untouched but present, these are not coincidences. They are the fingerprints of design. And design suggests that Basil Darnell was not merely thief, but murderer." The word fell heavy in the quiet room. Lady Addington, who had overheard, gave a strangled sob, but Holmes turned gently toward her. "Take comfort, madam. Whatever his guilt, the law will weigh it, not you. For tonight, rest secure that no shadow remains upon your husband's grave. Tomorrow, with the light, we shall seek the final proof." And so we left Addington House under the watch of Lestrade's men, the fog curling close about us once more. Holmes walked in silence, his figure dark against the gas lamps. But I sensed in him that keen energy which never slept until every thread was tied. I knew that the morrow would bring not rest, but revelation, but revelation. But morning broke with a pale, reluctant sun, its light filtering through a veil of mist that still clung to the city. Holmes had scarcely touched the breakfast Mrs. Hudson set before us. He paced the length of our sitting-room, pipe clenched between his teeth, his mind as restless as his stride. At last he halted before the window, his silhouette stark against the grey light. "Watson, the coffin tells us much, but the body tells us more. Before the grave closes, we must command a proper examination. The yard may hesitate, but I shall not. Today we reopen the dressing-room of Sir Percival Addington, and with it the final act of this drama." We set out at once, Holmes armed with the necessary authority gained by Lestrade's reluctant consent. Addington House greeted us with the same sombre silence as before. Lady Addington did not appear. It was Miss Willoughby who met us at the door, her eyes red from weeping, yet her manner steady. She led us to the dressing-room, where the faint odour of camphor and lilies lingered. Holmes dismissed her gently, then set to work with that precise intensity I had learned to respect. The room appeared unchanged since our first visit, but Holmes examined it now with even greater rigour. He tested the air with strips of litmus, peered at the hearth with his lens, and ran his fingers along the groove in the wood where he had once traced the passage of a wire. At last he returned to the waistcoat we had left folded upon a chair. With delicate care he scraped a minute residue from the lining into a glass vial. "There, Watson, the ghost of almond persists. A clumsy hand used prussic acid. Whether to hasten death or to make it appear natural, we shall soon learn." As he spoke, Lestrade entered with Dr. Malmesbury in tow. The physician looked ill at ease, his thin hands fumbling with his hat. "Really, Mr. Holmes," he protested, "is this disturbance necessary? The man is dead. His heart failed. I certified it." Holmes's gaze was keen. "And you did so with honesty, doctor. Yet honesty can be deceived. A puncture upon the forearm, a trace of poison in the lining, small details, but death often hides in trifles. Will you assist us in a more thorough examination?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded, compelled by Holmes's authority. Together they moved to the coffin, which had been kept under guard. The screws were removed once more, and the lid lifted. I confess the sight chilled me anew. Sir Percival lay as before, his features composed in that dread serenity only death confers. Yet Holmes's attention was not upon the face, but upon the left arm. With a surgeon's precision, he bared the flesh where the doctor had noted a mark. It was scarcely more than a pinprick, yet Holmes's expression sharpened as he drew from it the faintest trace of discoloration. "Observe, Watson," he said, passing me the lens. "The puncture is recent, the tissue faintly livid. A needle entered here, and through it a poison flowed. Not enough to convulse, but sufficient to silence. The seizure was but a mask." Dr. Malmesbury bent low, his eyes widening. "Good heavens! I did not think—" "No, doctor! You were summoned too late. The deed was done, and the appearance contrived. Yet appearances unravel before fact." Holmes replaced the wrappings with care, and closed the coffin once more. "Inspector, the charge against Captain Darnell must be expanded. He did not merely steal, he killed that he might steal unchecked. The prussic acid upon the waistcoat was spilt in his haste. The ether flask he brought as a contingency should noise betray him. He planned with sailor's cunning and failed with sailor's rashness." Lestrade scratched his chin, visibly unsettled. "You'll have me dig up every case I ever called natural, if this stands, Holmes. But the needle, the poison, it fits. Lord, it fits!" Holmes turned away from the coffin, his gaze falling once more upon the groove in the wood. One last puzzle remains. Why the wire? For what purpose did he stretch it across the chamber? Not for murder, that was done with the needle. No, it served another end. It rang a bell, perhaps, or moved a latch. We must discover to what it was joined. He traced the line to the baseboard, where a small aperture had been cunningly concealed. With a probe he followed its course, leading us at last to the adjoining room. A library smelling of dust and leather. There, behind a panel, Holmes revealed a simple mechanism. A bell wired to sound faintly when tugged. He set it in motion, and a thin chime answered. "Watson," he said, "we have our explanation for Lady Addington's assurance that her husband stirred after death. Basil Darnell contrived this signal to mislead, to create the illusion that breath yet lingered. He meant to delay suspicion, to cloak his deed until the ring was safely his. But he overreached. His false knocks betrayed him. As he spoke, a carriage was heard in the street below. Miss Willoughby returned, pale and agitated. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "my aunt begs you to come. She has received a note, delivered by hand. She fears it concerns Basil." Holmes took the paper with swift fingers. It bore only a few words, scrawled in haste. "The sea still waits. I go to her. Stop me if you can." Signed with the name Basil Darnell. Holmes's eyes blazed. He flees to the docks. "Watson, the chase is not yet done. The final knot must be tied before the tide turns." And without another word, he seized his hat and swept from the room. The paper still fluttering in his hand like a challenge answered. The cab raced through the waking streets, wheels hissing upon wet cobbles, as Holmes urged the driver to the river. His eyes gleamed with that hard light I had seen before in the chase, the light of a hawk stooping upon prey. "He has but one refuge, Watson," he said, his words clipped. "The sea. A sailor flees where he is most at home. He will make for the docks, slip aboard some vessel, and vanish under another name. But the tide does not serve him yet. We have the advantage of the clock." The Thames lay before us at last, broad and sullen under the morning mist. Cranes swung lazily above heaps of cargo, and sailors moved like ants among the rigging of steamers and clippers alike. Holmes sprang from the cab before it had stopped, his gaze sweeping the wharves with hawk-like precision. "To the Palermo berth, Watson!" he cried, striding along the quay. He would choose what is familiar. A South American packet, bound for Callao or Valparaiso, lies somewhere here. We pressed through knots of dockers and porters until the black hull of the Santa Lucia loomed above us, her name freshly painted in white upon the bow. A gangway stretched from the wharf, and upon it moved a figure I recognized at once. Basil Darnell, his head bent low beneath a seaman's cap. He carried no baggage, but his stride was purposeful. Holmes darted forward, signalling to Lestrade's men who had followed close. "Basil Darnell!" Holmes's voice cut across the clatter of chains and the gulls' cries. The captain turned sharply, his face pale beneath the brim. For a moment he froze. Then, with the desperate instinct of a hunted man, he bolted down the gangway and across the deck. The alarm rang among the crew, shouts rising in English and Spanish alike. We gave chase, stumbling over coils of rope and casks. Darnell leapt to the forecastle, then vanished below. Holmes never slackened, his long strides carrying him like a hound upon the scent. I followed, heart pounding, down a ladder into the dimness of the hold. The air was thick with tar and spices. Lanterns swung above stacked crates. Somewhere in that labyrinth our quarry moved, his boots striking hollow notes upon the planks. Holmes raised a hand for silence, then bent low, studying the dust upon the deck. "He passed here. See the scrape where his heel slipped. Forward, Watson." We crept among the crates until a sudden movement ahead betrayed him. Darnell sprang from concealment, a belaying pin raised high. He struck, but Holmes twisted aside, the blow glancing from a barrel. Before he could recover, Holmes had closed with him, seizing his wrist. They struggled fiercely, their shadows thrown grotesque upon the bulkhead by the swaying lantern. It was Lestrade who ended it, clambering down with 2 sailors in tow. The pin was wrested from Darnell's grasp, and iron once more closed upon his wrists. He sank upon a crate, spent, his chest heaving. For the first time his bravado failed him. He looked less a conspirator than a broken man. "I would have made my fortune," he muttered hoarsely. "Percy had the world's wealth and left me scraps. One stroke, one ring, and I could have stood as his equal." Holmes regarded him without triumph, his face grave. "You sought equality through crime, Captain, and found only chains. The sea you loved will not receive you now, save through iron bars, through iron bars, through iron." We brought him up into the daylight, where the mist had begun to lift from the water. The sight of his prisoner subdued even Lestrade's habitual satisfaction. "Well, Holmes," he said quietly, "there's no wriggling left in him. Murder and theft together. He'll swing, sure enough." Holmes's gaze was distant, fixed upon the sluggish current of the Thames. Justice, Inspector, is a harsher master than the sea. But remember, he was driven by envy more than malice. The law will judge, but history may pity. As we returned across the gangway, I could not help but feel the weight of tragedy in the man's downfall. The fog was thinning, yet it seemed to me the shadows clung still about the figure of Basil Darnell, once a proud sailor, now a prisoner destined for the gallows. Holmes, however, walked with his head high, the fire of certainty in his step. The case was closing, yet I sensed that his mind had already begun to turn to the final weaving of its threads, the revelation that would bind each clue into a single, inexorable truth. By the time we returned to Baker Street, the day had worn thin, the last glow of sunset smouldering behind the chimneys. Holmes had scarcely removed his coat before he flung himself into his armchair, pipe in hand, his gaze fixed upon the fire. I waited in silence, for I knew the tide of his thoughts must run its course before speech returned. At last he stirred, the blue smoke curling about his sharp profile like a wreath. "The pattern, Watson, lies complete. Each piece we gathered, the scratches upon the coffin lid, the cedar dust, the puncture on the arm, the missing ring, each seemed at first a riddle in itself. Now they compose a single picture. Basil Darnell was no common criminal. His scheme bore the hallmarks of calculation, though it ended in folly. He knew that Sir Percival's signet was the key to immense credit overseas. He enlisted Marek to steal it, but feared suspicion if the theft appeared too plain. Thus he contrived to imprison Farini, whose presence and reputation would divert all suspicion. The false knocking, produced by his bell-wire contraption, gave the illusion of life in the coffin, ensuring all eyes were drawn to the spectacle. In that moment of confusion, Marek's hand removed the ring. I nodded, recalling each step of the chase. But the murder itself, Holmes, was it necessary to his plan? Holmes leaned forward, his eyes intent. More than necessary, Watson. Sir Percival, though indulgent of his brother, would never have lent him such power. Darnell could not risk negotiation. He required silence. The needle delivered it. A subtle dose of prussic acid masked by the appearance of seizure. The doctor deceived, the widow persuaded. Murder cloaked in nature, theft cloaked in confusion. It was a play fit for the stage. Only the actor forgot that even the smallest trace betrays the greatest plot. His words fell into the crackle of the fire, and for a moment the room seemed filled with the very weight of the crime. I thought of Lady Addington, her proud composure shattered by betrayal, of Clara Willoughby, whose loyalty had blinded her, and of the dead man himself, struck down not by the hazards of commerce or the burden of wealth, but by the hand of his own blood. Holmes rose suddenly, pacing once more. Yet there remains a melancholy irony, Watson. Darnell, for all his scheming, gained nothing. The ring is recovered, the credit safe, and his life forfeit. His envy undid him as surely as any rope. He paused at the window, looking out upon the gathering night. There is a lesson here, if one cares to heed it, that the gravest dangers seldom lie in foreign rogues or adventurers, but in those who stand nearest, cloaked in trust. The following morning brought confirmation. Lestrade called upon us, weary yet satisfied, with the news that Darnell had confessed in part. The ring was produced before the magistrate, the mechanism in the library examined, the traces of poison attested by experts. The case would proceed swiftly, for the evidence was overwhelming. Holmes received the account with quiet nods, offering no triumph, only the calm of a mind that had already walked the path to its end. When Lestrade had gone, I ventured, "You will not attend the trial?" "No, Watson. The court is but an echo chamber for truths already spoken. My work lies in the uncovering, not the repeating. The world will call it justice. I call it inevitability." He turned back to his violin, drawing from it a strain of sombre music that filled the room with its haunting sweetness. As I listened, I reflected upon the case, its false knocks, its hidden panels, its bitter envy, and marvelled once more at the genius of the man who could thread such tangled skeins into a single cord. Thus ended the affair of the man who knocked from inside a coffin, a mystery that began in horror and ended in revelation, leaving behind not triumph, but the quiet ache of tragedy. And as Holmes played on, the fire burning low, I felt again that mixture of awe and melancholy which always attended his greatest victories, for they were victories won not over puzzles alone, but over the darker impulses of the human soul. Some days later, when the fog had lifted and the city gleamed under a brittle winter sun, I found Holmes in his customary seat, a sheaf of correspondence upon his knee. He greeted me with the faintest smile, one of those rare expressions that softened the severity of his features. "Ah, Watson, you arrive in time to witness the last ripple of our Coffin affair." He tapped the letters. "From Lady Addington, from the Yard, and from certain quarters abroad. The case has travelled farther than the Thames, it seems." I took a chair opposite him. Curiosity piqued. "Abroad, you say?" "Indeed. Word has reached the Peruvian consulate that documents were intercepted, which bore the forgery of Sir Percival's seal. They were crude attempts, no doubt prepared in anticipation of Darnell's success. Had the ring been delivered to his agents, whole warehouses of nitrate would have been at their mercy. Credits shifted, fortunes overturned. It is a sober reminder, Watson, how a single jewel on a gentleman's hand may sway markets an ocean away." He set aside the foreign letter and opened Lady Addington's. "She writes with admirable composure, though grief runs beneath her words. She thanks us, not for unmasking her brother, which she cannot yet forgive, but for preserving her husband's honour. She speaks of laying him to rest at last, the doubts removed, the Coffin no longer a theatre for deception. One cannot but respect her fortitude." I remained silent for a time, picturing the proud widow in her black weeds, enduring scandal and sorrow with dignity. At length I said, "It is strange, Holmes, how crime so often arises not from poverty, but from envy. Darnell was not destitute, yet he risked all for wealth he did not need." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he lit his pipe. "You touch upon the essence of human folly, my dear fellow. Need seldom drives men to crime. Desire does. The desire to equal, to surpass, to taste what is forbidden. Basil Darnell desired not sustenance, but parity with his brother. In seeking it, he proved his inferiority more thoroughly than poverty ever could." He leaned back, exhaling smoke that curled lazily toward the ceiling. "There is also the irony of Farini. He came as a schemer, yet ended as victim. His imprisonment in the Coffin was cruel, but in that cruelty lies proof of his innocence. The very trick meant to condemn him exonerated him." "Do you think he will remain in England?" I asked. "Unlikely. A man of his restless stripe will sail again, though perhaps chastened. His dreams of nitrate riches are scattered, but I dare say he will find another enterprise. Such men are never idle, though seldom prosperous." Holmes rose suddenly, crossing to the window. Outside, a costermonger cried his wares, and children played upon the pavement, heedless of the tragedies played out in drawing-rooms and courts. It is curious, Watson, how swiftly the world forgets. A man dies, another stands in chains, and yet London hums as ever. Only we carry the memory entire, like actors who have played their part behind the curtain while the audience departs satisfied. I could not help but smile. "And you, Holmes, will you dismiss it so readily? It seemed to stir you more deeply than most." He turned, his face in shadow. It stirred me because it laid bare the frailty of trust. To strike down one's brother for envy, such treachery chills even my cynical bones. And yet, Watson, I must dismiss it, for cases do not pause that I may brood upon them. Even now another awaits. This note, delivered an hour past, speaks of a disappearance in Belgravia. A lady gone from her chamber, as if by magic. Intriguing, is it not? I laughed despite myself. Then you will not rest. Rest, my dear fellow, is the privilege of the unimaginative. He drew his cloak about him, the violin bow still upon the mantel where he had left it the night before. Come, Watson, the coffin is closed, the dead are at peace, and the living must account for themselves elsewhere. London is inexhaustible, and so must we be, and so must we be. And so thus it was, as often before, that one case flowed into the next, and the echoes of the man who knocked from inside a coffin faded into memory. Yet whenever I pass Kensal Green in the mist, I fancy I still hear, faint and ghostly, the echo of those knocks that first summoned us into darkness, and I remember how Holmes's keen eyes turned terror into truth. Holmes wasted little time in exchanging pipe for cloak, his energy revived by the promise of fresh complexity. The note lay upon the mantel where he had shown it to me, its script hurried but unmistakably distressed. A gentleman imploring Holmes to investigate the sudden disappearance of his sister, a Lady Selina Carfax, vanished from her Belgravia chambers in the dead of night without sign of entry or struggle. Holmes tucked the paper into his pocket and turned to me with the familiar gleam in his eyes. You see, Watson, how swiftly one shadow gives way to another. The Addington affair closes, but mystery never sleeps. We took a hansom through the bright but brittle morning, the frost still clinging to iron rails and roof slates. Holmes spoke little, save to observe that Belgravia offered fewer opportunities for unnoticed intrusion than most districts. Wide squares, vigilant porters, respectable households. Such places pride themselves on security. That a lady could vanish there, Watson, is therefore all the more remarkable. We must be prepared for a riddle, as delicate as it is urgent. The residence we sought stood upon Eaton Square, a tall, dignified house with a uniform facade like its neighbours. At the door, we were met by the author of the note, a young man of scholarly aspect who introduced himself as Mr. Edmund Carfax. His manner was strained, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He ushered us quickly within to a richly appointed drawing-room, where the gravity of his tale was unfolded. My sister, he began, retired last evening at 10. I myself was in the library until past midnight. At 7 this morning her maid found the chamber empty. The bed was scarcely touched, the window bolted, the door locked from within. We broke it open, fearing illness, but found nothing, no note, no trace. Only this. He handed Holmes a small handkerchief of fine lace, upon which a faint smear of grey dust was visible. Holmes held it delicately between finger and thumb, his eyes narrowing. Dust from stone, perhaps, or mortar. Not from this chamber, I think. Pray, show me the room. We ascended to the second floor, where Lady Selina's bedchamber opened from a corridor lined with portraits. The room was elegantly furnished, the bed-covers scarcely ruffled, a candle guttered low upon the stand. Holmes moved with the precision of a surgeon, testing the bolt of the window, examining the lock of the door, scrutinizing the hearth where ashes lay faint in the grate. At last he bent to the floor, where a minute sprinkling of the same grey dust lay close to the skirting board. You perceive, Watson, he said softly, the same substance as upon the handkerchief, but note its position, not tracked by a boot, but fallen from above. He raised his lens to the cornice, where a small fissure in the plaster ran across the ceiling. Ah, here is our doorway, though invisible to ordinary eyes. A passage above, perhaps, leading from the roof. This house may boast of locks and bolts, but it has forgotten what lies overhead. Carfax grew pale, but who could enter so? The roof is sheer, the heights dangerous. Holmes's gaze was intent, Dangerous, yes. Impossible, no. And to one who sought secrecy, the only path. Tell me, sir, did your sister possess any valuables of unusual kind? Jewels, perhaps, or papers? She inherited a casket from our late father. Carfax replied hesitantly. It contained certain bonds, railway shares of high value. But the casket lies secure in her bureau. See, it is here, untouched. He unlocked a drawer to reveal the small box, its contents apparently undisturbed. Holmes examined it with swift fingers. Untouched to the eye, yes. Yet observe, this lock has been opened by masterly skill, not by its key. The shares may have been copied, even if not removed. Your sister's disappearance may hinge not upon theft of substance, but of trust. She may have been drawn away by persuasion rather than force. Carfax clasped his head in his hands. But by whom? She is of steady character, not given to fancies. That, Holmes replied, is what we must learn. There is an intelligence here that works in silence, as Darnell's did with noise. One contrived confusion by knocks, the other by stillness. Both demand pursuit. He rose, his decision formed. Watson, we must examine the roof and the adjoining houses. The trail lies not upon the floor, but in the air above us. So once more, with the frost glittering upon the slates and the winter wind sharp against our faces, we followed Holmes into mystery. And though the Addington case lay behind us, I felt the same tightening of the heart, for I knew that wherever Holmes turned his gaze, shadows lengthened and the truth, however deeply buried, could never long remain hidden. The climb to the roof was treacherous, the slates slick with frost and the wind biting like knives, but Holmes moved with the confidence of a cat. I followed less gracefully, my hands chilled to the bone. From that height we saw the long row of Belgravia houses, their chimneys smoking lazily into the pale sky. Holmes's keen eye swept the line until it fixed upon a narrow gap where tiles had been displaced. He crept toward it, and there we discovered the faint imprint of a boot, recent and sharp. "Here, Watson," he murmured, "is the road by which Lady Selina was spirited away. The dust in her chamber was but the debris shaken from this fissure. Someone descended from the roof, entered by the ceiling panel, and withdrew with her quietly, swiftly, and with her consent, I think, for there was no struggle." We traced the path across the roof to the neighbouring house, outwardly respectable yet showing signs of neglect. Holmes descended with the agility of a sailor and rapped firmly upon the door. After some delay, it was opened by a man of sallow countenance, whose manner betrayed both nervousness and hostility. Holmes brushed past him without ceremony, and in the drawing-room beyond we found Lady Selina herself, pale but unharmed, seated beside a gentleman of suave appearance. Her brother, who had followed close, cried out in relief. But Holmes lifted a hand. "One moment. Lady Selina, allow me to explain what you scarcely dare confess. This gentleman persuaded you with talk of investments, of fortunes to be made with the aid of your bonds. He gained your confidence, urged you to secrecy, and at last led you here under the pretense of protecting those documents. Am I correct?" Tears glistened in her eyes as she bowed her head. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. He spoke of dangers, of frauds at our own house. I thought I believed." Holmes's gaze turned to the suave stranger, now visibly discomposed, a confidence trickster of the highest order, preying upon trust and fear. "You see, Watson, how envy destroyed Darnell, while deceit nearly ensnared Lady Selina. Both cases, though distinct, share a common thread. Wealth as bait, trust as snare. The man attempted to bluster, but Lestrade, who had been summoned by Holmes's foresight, entered at that instant with constables in tow. The arrest was swift and decisive. Lady Selina was escorted safely home, her brother's gratitude almost overwhelming. That evening, as we sat once more at Baker Street, I could not help reflecting on the strange symmetry of events. 2 cases in as many days, Holmes, both born of greed, both threatening families at their very heart. Holmes, stretched languidly in his chair, regarded me through the haze of his pipe smoke, and both resolved by the same principle, Watson, that truth lies in trifles. A scratch upon a coffin screw, a dusting of plaster upon a handkerchief. Such details speak louder than testimony. Men may lie, but the world does not. He fell silent, his gaze fixed upon the fire. At length he added in that reflective tone he rarely allowed himself, "There is much to sadden in such work. The world sees triumph, yet I see tragedy. The widow betrayed by her own brother, the sister deceived by a false suitor. Still, if by exposing such shadows we preserve the innocent, perhaps that is triumph enough." I left him there, the violin later rising in melancholy strains above the hum of Baker Street, and I thought to myself that the true mystery of Sherlock Holmes was not in the puzzles he solved, but in the strange blend of brilliance and solitude by which he bore them. And thus concluded the affair of the man who knocked from inside a coffin, a case of envy and deception, of death and discovery, ending, as ever, with the quiet genius of my friend, who turned terror into truth and left the world to wonder, world to wonder, world